So to get us started, I want to acknowledge that we in this webinar, it's taking place throughout the unceded territory of California, home to nearly 200 tribal nations. We acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants of our various regions. I specifically would like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from Half Moon Bay, California, which sits on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, who are the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. As the original stewards of this land, the Ramaytush Ohlone understood the interconnectedness of all things and maintained harmony with nature for millennia. And I honor the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples for their enduring commitment to Warep, Mother Earth. And as our climate stewards know, we're really trying to engage in really accessing and learning more about different ways of knowing and being to support our ongoing community resilience efforts. So I personally first met our speaker, AshEL, through my work at the Monterey Bay Aquarium when he was working for the Alliance for Climate Education. And I was immediately impressed with his energy and deep knowledge and wisdom about how to connect with and communicate specifically with young people, as I was working with teen volunteers at the time. AshEL earned a master's degree in Transpersonal Psychology and lives in Oakland, California. He has worked with the Alliance for Climate Education, has been a Green for All Fellow, a climate justice, race, and activism instructor at San Francisco State University, and taught conflict resolution skills with Soul Shoppe. He is the founder of Soulestial Church, Earth Amplified, and S.O.S, JUICE, which stands for System Out of Our System. He is a co-founder of United Roots, Oakland's Green Youth Arts and Media Center. He serves on the board of Hip Hop is Green, an international organization promoting the 10th element of hip hop, health, and wellness. And AshEL's most recent project is EFAM, a collective of community organizers, farmers and gardeners, and healers committed to bringing essential food and medicines to all. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to AshEL to share with us a little bit about his background and the journey that has brought him to this space today.
Yes, thank you so much for having me, Sarah, and the whole team. Decided to continue to weave this conversation on climate, health, wellness. Build these bridges and links so we can increase our communication skills and awareness of how to reach as many people as possible. Yeah, so you want me to just sort of go back to like the beginning, or I'm just trying to look for some direction around like how much what to actually share.
Yeah, so you've had such this varied and amazing connection with all different communities. What was maybe the thing that got you started in your awareness of some of the justice issues that really you would have the opportunity to take action on in your community?
Right. Well, I guess, first, I grew up in Chicago. So I grew up at 1080 West 14th Street, downtown Chicago, Barbara Jean Wright Court. So there's like a series of like, they would call them projects in Chicago. But I was always bussed out of my neighborhood to go to magnet schools in Chicago. It was the Beasley Academic Center. So, from that point, I definitely started to see the disparity, the difference in different neighborhoods, different income brackets, reason why I had to come out of my neighborhood to go to another school. So I think, as young people, we start to see these distinctions between the haves and the have-nots, this sense of justice in that way. And my definition of justice and that sort of evolved over time to something that has nothing more to do with like universal laws and things like this, but which I can go more into later. But I think that might have been the beginning of that. When I came from, Beasley Academic Center in Chicago, I ended up going to a school called Oak Park River Forest High School in Oak Park. Some people may be familiar with that because there was a lot of gang activity in my neighborhood. My family was like, we got to move out of the neighborhood. And what was amazing about that experience was that my school had 3,500 students in it. And it was like 700 people in my class. This is a high school, right? But I think in that transferring over to that school from St. Ignatius College Prep, which is the smaller school, high school that I went to, there was so many different socioeconomic backgrounds, people from various cultures, such that I had such a wide swath of experiences and people I could communicate with. And I think that opened me up to be able to, like, wow, there's a commonality there. You know, there's something unique to everyone, but also there's some common threads just from the virtue of having the experience of being around a lot of people in high school and being able to intimately experience that. So I guess that's one aspect. I also remember growing up with my aunt, who was a Black Panther in the Black Panther Party, and remember hearing her recount stories that included, you know, this sovereignty aspect of, you know, reclaiming our health for ourselves, not necessarily depending on any governmental agencies or outside support. Like, how do we create community resilience within our own community? So, you know, Jules, she really instilled that to me. And I remember growing up in Thanksgiving, and really startled me when we were at Thanksgiving dinner, and she would come in and have these long tirades about Thanksgiving and the history of Thanksgiving and why it needs to be reclaimed and reformed, and why we should really just be going out to the community to give actually in those time periods. And I remember my pops during Christmas, we would go out, even though we lived in a Barbara Wright course, we would go out to neighboring sort of community urban housing development areas, and we would give gifts to those people. And then these are distinct memories I have growing up. I also remember my pops literally, you know, giving CPR to someone in the street, just pulling over, seeing someone convulsing, and started doing CPR on this person. So I just have, you know, my family, so, you know, sort of started this awareness and this type of, you know, like, we are because our ancestors were, and we are because of who we are collectively. Yeah, so I mean, I can go, you know, deeper in that, but.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great place to start. Two of the things that we really focus on in the new UC Climate Stewards course are the idea of systems thinking, and that's definitely something that you have already mentioned, as well as we're trying to raise awareness of the community of life, which in a lot of circles is referred to as nature or biodiversity. Mm-hmm. And we're trying to connect the fact that we as human beings are part of the story. We can't separate ourselves from it. So the systems and the world around us are all interconnected. And I know from what you just said about kind of how your awareness was raised in some of the work that you're currently doing, that this is something you're really intimately engaged in.
Right. Yeah, I mean, yeah, systems. I mean, so, you know, from early on, I mean, as you know, growing up African American, there's like a deep emphasis just in the narrative that we're sort of born into. There's a deep emphasis on an acute like awareness around justice and injustice. It's part of the cultural sort of talk, you know, in some ways because of you know, just the history. So you start learning about history, you start learning about your family struggles, you start talking about different you know, different family members. You start to get that, wow, this is something that a part of my dress as in the skin that I live in. So that becomes a real thing to navigate. And I think and then as you go, and as I went to school and I started going to undergrad in University of Rochester in New York, you start traveling more, you start to see how different people relate to that. And some people sort of, you know, even the African American or Black, they don't necessarily, that people hold that in different ways, I should say. So my family is really big into education. And it was education because it was a way out. I mean, literally, I remember my pops was, you know, telling me, he's like, yeah, we're trying to get you out of the penitentiary and out of the jail, you know, and get you out of the graveyard. So, you know, having, experiences where I had police brutality when I was like 6 or 7. Playing basketball outside of my house and police rolling up on us, and very innocently, we just playing basketball, and the police officer saying like, "Hey, you look like so and so," and I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about, and yeah, you were over there, and him sort of roughing us up, him not knowing anything about me or my dreams or what I'm about at all, or what I got on my report card last week, or any of that type of stuff, but simply looking cosmetically at a situation where young Black youth were playing basketball. That sort of, informed a lot to me at the early age around status and in that type of biodiversity, in that sense, yeah. So
yeah, and one of the things that we are trying to raise a profile of, as a lot of organizations are, is that we can't come up with climate change solutions unless we address climate justice. Because with all of the problems with the system, there are things in place where we have to fix everything at once. And by fixing the justice issues, we address the larger issues of carbon pollution and other, access issues to resources, the needs for adaptation in different neighborhoods. And I know that, I'm not sure when you came out here to California, but you've been in California for at least 12 or so years, because I remember meeting you back in about 2008. And really, you've engaged so much in various communities in the East Bay. I'm just curious about how you've seen the different issues in the different neighborhoods related. I know you do a lot of work with food and health and those sorts of things.
Yeah. Yeah. So, in 2008, I went to Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, and that's why I really got into shamanism and Taoism, and was really, started touring doing music as well. But I remember I worked with Grandmaster Lee Tien and Tien Gong, did some really deep, sort of spiritual work around, I guess Qigong, Celestial Qigong, they would call it Universal Qigong, which is really cosmic in some ways. But I remember having this moment where I left these retreats, and also I started working with curanderos from Peru at that time too, 2005, 2006. Work a lot with, healers. Work with the different plant medicines. That was a deep informing about the deep nature, like who I am on a deep level. But I remember coming out of that experience and had a different perspective on everything in terms of humans and our relationship to the planet and the interconnectedness that. And then I saw something brilliant when I worked with Van Jones. A lot of you might know Van Jones, Green for All, Ella Baker Center. And it allowed me to have these spiritual experiences that I had and relate to something that was propositional, in the sense that there was an environmental justice movement who was really forward with looking at, wow, we need to examine and acknowledge there's environmental racism. There's particular areas that low-income communities where there's dumping that was happening. There's brown sites that are happening. There's a disrespect of those people as being disposable, especially as we started doing more reentry program work. I remember going into prisons with Van Jones, just 3 or 4 of us, going into San Quentin in a program called Green Life in San Quentin, and really linking these connections between recycling and disposable individuals, and how do we give birth to something new, allow people a process of recreation. So that's when I started getting into the solution aspect of what's going to really create transformation on these multiple different levels, as folks are in prison learning about the larger planetary issues. And it was really endearing and really deep, that folks were, went through this experience of being in prison, but found some freedom in dreaming about the earth consciousness. So I had, varied experiences that led me to the solution space. But I think that, by virtue of working with Green Frog, I was able to visit and travel around the country and visit a lot of communities communities in New Orleans or in Cancer Alley, communities were devastated by extraction industries, but weren't necessarily benefactors of sort of the financial benefits. And that turned to an international perspective when I started, traveling more, but also learning more about what's going on in Nigeria with Chevron, for example. So I started to get a picture, even before Copenhagen, the infamous Copenhagen international talks, that there was, it sort of expanded my view of what I was experiencing maybe in my school or in my neighborhood, and put a global perspective on it, such that I was like, wow, there is something inherent. Though we're all living under one sun, there are mechanisms via sort of systems, like capitalist systems, that definitely allow for winners and losers in a way. So yeah, I mean, that was definitely working with Green for All definitely put me in that space of understanding that more deeper, just as I was getting to more communities. And even right here in the Bay Area, working a lot with Richmond, folks in Richmond, working with folks, directly dealing with, the fallout from explosions at Chevron refinery, but yet having these tensions because there were certain people also getting paid and having jobs from that, and understanding the tensions within the community. So it led me to some complexities that I have to unpack, which leads me to some other work that I'm doing now around just getting clarity and a spiritual root being more addressed, that in that common space that we all share. So hope I'm answering your question. I feel like I'm trying to get to where you're asking.
No, that's great. I mean, you've addressed several things that we are working to raise awareness of in the California Naturalist and Climate Stewards community. One of the things you talked about was transforming, and we really recognize that transformational learning is a big thing where you live an experience and it does something to the way that you then view everything else for the rest of your life. And so we're trying to promote some of that throughout the work that our community does. And you also spoke to just a few things like Cancer Alley and the different neighborhoods that are really adversely impacted because of the systems that have forced certain groups to live in certain places, often people of color, often low income people who have no other place to live. And we exist in this space of different narratives where some people say, well, they live there because they don't want to live anywhere else. Well, no, it's the system that has forced them to stay in these places where they're continuing to have health problems and all of that. And, I know that, some of the things that you have done, one of my best memories of you is back in 2010 with the Plastic State of Mind music video that you did. And I know that's where a lot of people began to get to know you. And it's just, as I've gotten to know you over time, just your ability to connect with communities and speak through art, coming to these spaces as a trusted messenger who understands from within the issues that are happening, but also having an understanding of the larger issues and what needs to happen to raise the health profile, to get resources to the people that don't have access to them. So, you've done so many of these things, and I'm just curious, when you think about the work that you're doing, what do you think is most important with connecting with people, since that's one of the things that you really do across the different activities that you participate in?
Yeah, I think first and foremost is just just being present with individuals and really being present with the larger issues. So there is a tendency to just have a reaction to everything, but I think there's when we hear things, we feel we have this emotion, some injustice happening, or we sort of nod our head and we shake our head and we feel this emotion and we sort of can empathize and sympathize with that. I think there's that extra beat of like sort of listening, in which that person that we're listening to or the communities that we're listening to can actually provide the solution. Because that lived experience. It's interesting. I remember I was working with Alliance for Climate Education actually, and I was working in East Oakland at McClymonds High School, and down the street is another high school that's a Catholic high school. That's McClymonds is more low income, primarily Latino and African American, lower resource for sure. But I think they have a lot of really cool stuff going on there. But the other school is this Catholic school that's really literally down the street from the school. And I had the privilege to be able to be in both schools within a short time period and how they perceive each other. Noting that there was still, boyfriend, girlfriend drama, and there was all the same things, similar things going on, but definitely different social economics, and definitely different listening of what was possible for the students. Even if you're a principal or you're a teacher at a low-income school, you still have a certain listening, for what's the potentialities. So I remember talking to this one student at this white girl, 17, 18, and she was like, well, what I don't know is why they don't pick up the trash in their neighborhood, this type of thing. And it was really tell because it sort of indicates that perception, that somehow like the otherization was there truly, but it was a perception that somehow that these folks don't care, or they don't know any better, and they just they don't care. So, but my perception wasn't so much that. So I had to. What I realized at that moment is that there needs to be like a cultural exchange of sorts, because I could explain in terms of transformative learning, it would be for them to actually interact with each other. So I was working to set that up. I didn't really get that set up at that time. There's different programs like Mosaic Project, different projects that actually have people interact more, have more FaceTime, and have more communication. And that in itself is transformative, because then these solutions can be shared, and this sense of relatedness, background of relatedness, can create more enrollment for what the other person is communicating, and actually tease out some more of these answers that we're all looking for our own particular problems, because we kind of need each other in this way. In the same way that when I went into San Quentin, the people who get healed the most and get the most out of going into San Quentin is the folks who actually go to support the people in San Quentin. It's like, it looks as if though, like, we're actually doing something heroic when we go in every Friday and spend our time here. We can pat ourselves on the shoulder, but we actually get most out of it. So when it talks about communication, we all have to look at our skill set and look at our skill. Me, I grew up with hip hop culture and I work with youth. So that's the art form of that is a direct communication. And that's something that's universal, music, right? So I had an upper hand and advantage in that way, because I was able to, do Plastic State of Mind and talk about plastic pollution, and it can get almost like 1 million views, because anyone from a lot of places around the planet can get like, yeah, there's like a lot of plastic pollution around. And though those things are like sort of universal, that also certain communities can relate more to it. One thing that I note though, when I showed the Plastic State of Mind video, since we're talking about this Alliance for Climate Education, I remember going to one school. Again, it's the listening that is communication. It's not so much like speaking to someone, it's more like the reaching to see where they're at and what they think about themselves, and how the community is thinking about each other. That is most important, in terms of going into a space and creating a space of that transformative learning, and creating opportunity for like folks to be empowered themselves to make their own solution. Almost like a therapy aspect to it. I remember going into the school and I noticed that the teachers really had given up on these kids. And they brought us in, they were like, well, not McClimon's, but it's another school, and they were like, well, these kids just trash the place, they don't care. You know, but really the whole energy was that they didn't care for the students either in some ways. You know, they had really resigned, like, you know, I was in the presentation, people were throwing stuff, and they sort of tolerated it, and they allowed it because it became a job for them. And you could feel that when you go into so many schools, like thousands of schools. Spoke to, like, you know, almost 200,000 students over a 5-year time period. So you start to see, like, oh wow, so I remember having to turn off my presentation because people weren't listening anyways. And I had to just talk to them direct, you know, about what they really wanted to create for their lives, you know. Because sometimes we sort of impress upon people that, wow, a moral perspective, like, wow, you should just be interested in being for your environment or caring about the climate for these reasons, right? But I think first and foremost, we have to connect with what people are excited about or interested in and what their primary issues are to begin with. So for them, this particular school in Vallejo, you know, you start to talk to them, and they were like, you know, it came out that, you know, certain people's brothers were away at prison for 5 years. There's a potentiality of different family members being abused to different substances, which weren't allowed to be present that day, right? And be present with them in that way so they could feel that emotional support. So when it came to, like, attention, for example, attention to the school environment, it was reflective of this internal world that wasn't receiving the nourishment that it needed. It wasn't being listened to. It wasn't being heard. And I think this is that sort of psycho-spiritual aspect that sometimes gets left out of activism, which has to do with the whole person. In the same way, from an ecological sense, you're talking about permaculture, we do ground zero, right? You know, zone zero. So we have to deal with all this, the whole aspect of the self in that way. Like, we wouldn't, when talking about a tree, we wouldn't leave out the soil or anything like that, right? So the soil of the individuals weren't getting basic things that we sort of take for granted, because we might have lived in certain households where mom and dad was present, and we had a meal every night, and we had a lunch bag, go to school, and we had all these things. But for them, it was different. So for me, it became important to, if they were interested, whatever they were interested and excited about, to nourish that, and really get a sense of validating them around their experience, and simultaneously nourishing their gifts. Because it became apparent that it's really important, almost in a Taoistic sense, like, you know, we allow folks to be in their original state of beauty, and then beauty can be emanated externally. So doing this type of work, when I visited the school and people got excited about me coming, they were like, wow, this guy actually listens. And he's like, even though he comes from some organization that talks about the environment, it really, in climate and science, it really became important for me to allow, like, really talk to the staff and, like, wow, like, you know, we need to bring back that music program, or we really need to allow space for, you know, sure, this guy, like, he graffitied the whole wall and he's been in detention for weeks, maybe set up a space for him to do a mural, right? Like, really look at, like, wow, like, acknowledge the talent and acknowledge the beauty in this. And lo and behold, by the end of the year, because they nurtured this self-respect and they started to respect themselves, they started to respect the school grounds. And I didn't have to say anything about plastic pollution and the endocrine system and, you know, all these different things we would talk about on a scientific level. I mean, eventually there was space for that conversation, but there wasn't space for that until these other issues were addressed. It's almost like a Maslow perspective, right? Like, you kind of got to address certain things first and foremost before you get to that. I mean, we've all, even, you know, all of us, we've all had, you know, arguments with partners or whatever, and you kind of want to go in and get to the solution, and we just want to fix it. You just want to fix the climate, you know, but then we have to, like, note who's in front of us. You know, we're dealing with humans, and people with various backgrounds. And so, you know, my approach became more when I worked with Soul Shoppe, which did the anti-bullying work, we started to transform folks from bullies even to folks who, again, who were potentially leaders in the school. So a lot of reframing had to happen. So folks who, when we sat down with them and we sat in big groups of 90 students, 100 students, and we were working on, this anti-bullying work, another jewel came out around how to get the school to be orderly and really respectful. These internal aspects would happen. Like, we started to find out, wow, the background of John, when he goes home, he actually doesn't go home.
Yeah.
He doesn't have the same resources. So then that's why, and he's playing this out with other people. Mm-hmm. So then allowing him the space to actually be himself in that way and actually hear that and have that other people see that and witness that, transform them, even with the teachers, transform that person from a bully to a person who just needed to be listened to and spoken to in this way. And those people turned into leadership in the school, literally, by virtue of their resilience, because it was recognized like that. So that type of dynamic became instrumental to my activism. Even working with, I remember we were working on the Gulf issue with Dan. I remember BP, it was heartbreaking every day to see the, millions of gallons of crude oil, just, and no one could stop it. And it was just this type of thing. It was like, wow, like, we are just like messing up big time, right? But then I remember talking to Dan, I was on the phone with him, and he was doing a lot of organizing, and I had dreamed up this aspect based off also of the landmark education. I don't know if I'm familiar with that, but that sort of informed me a lot too. And I was like, what if BP, with all that infrastructure and resources, became the hero? And I came to this thing called BP the Hero. And I wrote a piece on it. But at the time, I was a little afraid to put it out because, it was so much energy at like blaming. And it's not that it's right or wrong that BP should not be blamed for this issue. It's just that when somebody's banging on your door and telling you you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, it's harder for you to turn around and see a different perspective and to see like the keto of it and looking at the horizon together, right?
Right.
And this perspective was really, he was like, wow, that's really powerful. We need those ideas right now. And it's not that we implemented something in policy, but there was a conversation with them to retrain and reskill folks on using just mycology to clean up oil spills and, deeper scientific, the deeper science of what was out at the time around oil spill cleanup, et cetera. But that idea of that started to inform my activism to start reframing individuals and people and systems, such as to get rid of this dichotomy of this right and wrong and look at like, well, what can we co-create together?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. You've touched on so many things. Your breadth of experience is just amazing. And, just pulling to the top a couple of things I heard you say, listening is so important. One of the things we're trying to bring awareness of in the new Climate Stewards course is social emotional resilience and trauma-aware practices. Mm-hmm. For the very reasons you spoke of, we all have this different lived experience, and our brain biologically reacts in certain ways to protect ourselves. And mm-hmm. if we don't listen to other people's experience, we can never understand what is happening in all of that. But to that point, just hearing a lot about your experiences, we wanted to give all the participants on the call today an opportunity to share a little bit about what's going on in their communities. So we could have an idea of what's going on across the state of California and how some of the work that you've done with this, in this green space, the environmental work, grassroots work with just different informal leaders, how some of these things might tie into their experience. So we have a link to a Google Doc that I think Brooke is going to put into the chat. And we have a couple questions on there that we would like folks to answer. So if you want to click on that link, and that'll open a Google Doc for you. The first question is, what county are you from? We want to get a little bit an idea of where our folks are today, and you can just start typing in this document, everyone. And then the three other questions we have in that space are, what are the public health impacts where you live? because as AshEL has spoken about today, this is something that is incredibly important and maybe not on everyone's radar. Also, how has wildfire, heat, agricultural runoff, change precipitation, or disease risk, what is it? What's happening? How's that impacted your community? And then who in your community cannot access resources that might address some of the public health impacts and the other climate impacts I just mentioned. So people are typing away in this space. So I'm going to share my screen just so we all can see this. And AshEL, when you and I spoke the other day, I shared some of what's going on near the spaces where some of our climate stewards are working down in Southern California, around the Salton Sea, the communities out in the Coachella Valley. And you know, what you were talking about transformational experience, listening, the whole person, we often don't necessarily address that. But the more we exist in these spaces of climate disruption, the more it becomes apparent that all of this is interconnected. And while folks are typing, I just wanted to ask you, you know, you mentioned getting to know people, getting to understand what they need. I'm curious how you think we might be able to really activate the space where we may have shared values, but we don't necessarily have shared experience, and how we might be able to work better with our communities. You know, as you were speaking of the two different high schools, literally just down the street, they're in the same physical community, but they're not necessarily in the same like mind space, personal experience community. So how might we be able to make connections and work in those spaces toward resilience together?
Right. Yeah. I mean, so, I mean, for example, I mentioned Mosaic Project, and they work with people. They're not necessarily, you know, have a particular like environmental focus, but I think it's a good example of an organization that is working to look at age differences. I mean, they have folks, young youth and elders, for example. So they use all these different, large, diverse community they work with, and they do trainings and they have education accordingly. You know, different racial backgrounds, different languages. So they just experimented with that and came up with a whole program that's been robust for the past 10, 15 years, I think. I think it's out of Santa Cruz, I think, at this point. And I really like what they've been doing. But I think, you know, in terms of, you know, folks who, I think it's beautiful what you said, like shared values. I think there's room for more of that sharing and building on these common ground spaces. Like me, for example, with EFAM, so in the beginning of the COVID situation, maybe like April, we were like, wow, we need to go out and work in the community and work with folks who are unhoused, because there was a lot of talk about sheltering in place. And, you know, Soulshot, co-founder of EFAM, was like, well, how are people going to shelter in place without shelter, for example? And we were doing a lot of direct action work in terms of direct service, where she was, you know, delivering water, setting up water stations, hand sanitizer, things that the news and everyone was indicating people to do wasn't necessarily an option for those communities. And we also wanted to big up the nature, big up natural medicines, and really promote that, because those are accessible, they're ubiquitous if you have the eye to look for them, and they could be of assistance while there was this you know, energy of fear and like waiting on a vaccine and all this type of thing, and shock and all that. Like, well, actually, we have each other. We have mutual aid. So what was fascinating about that was, and which I think is I'm really excited about, was that when we put the call out for volunteers, there was a lot of people could relate, right? Because we created organizations at the intersection of environment, climate, food justice, health and wellness, um, housing displacement. I mean, we place ourselves in a center that, and what was beautiful was that those folks who were always joke and say, like, everyone can agree with a lemon or apple. So when we put the call for volunteers, I was surprised to see that there were folks who were, they're Trump supporters. They were like avid Trump supporters. There were folks who were avid whatever supporters, right? And they all could come down to the kitchen and like, yeah, we actually can be in service like that. So I think the simplicity of it is really powerful. Like, I think there's different ways to engage that question around, how do you build common ground, but also account for these differences. COVID, this whole situation being on these Zooms make it a little difficult to have certain processes that would allow for that. But I think ultimately, one thing is to note asset mapping, right? So one may have certain skill set. One, for example, for EFAM, we noted that a lot of people were sheltered in place. We gave them opportunity. We said, hey, we're going to give away a bunch of free food, juices, smoothies, medicines to folks, but you may have resources. You might be home from work, then you can actually support in this way. You can actually, or you might be a grant writer, or you may have different skill sets that we can actually utilize. So you can actually participate in this process and actually put your best foot forward in that way. So I think asset mapping is really a powerful thing for us too, just noting what are the skill sets within and without a community and seeing how those can mesh and merge. And being honest about that can allow for something bigger than the greater parts, greater than individual parts. Hopefully I'm answering your question, because
no, it's great.
Okay.
Yeah, I would, just this last thing you spoke to about like asset mapping and finding out who is there, what is there, what skills are there. Part of what we're doing with the UC Climate Stewards program is a community and ecosystem resilience assessment, where we're working with our partner organizations to establish a baseline. Where are we today? And then as we continue to work forward with the vulnerabilities in our communities, can we move the needle? And part of that process is, asset mapping. And, there's a ton of resources in the state of California, from things like CHAT, the California Heat Assessment Tool, to find out where is it going to be hot versus where are the cooling centers, where people can actually, get in a place of safety from the heat. And, all of what you just said also goes back to this idea of listening. And we really are trying to raise the profile of relationships and how relationships are founded on communication. And communication isn't about me telling you things. It's about me listening to you to find out, well, what do you think? What do you need? Where do we connect? And then when the listening has provided, a stepping stool to the next, conversation, then we can get engaged in how we can work together and act together. Right. So it's everything you're talking about is, all interconnected, and just, it's a beautiful picture of this community of life and the whole people that we are when we interact in these spaces.
Yeah. With the Soul Shoppe, again, Soul Shoppe is really transformative for me just because it dealt with emotional social learning. And there was a lot of training, actually. It's kind of like, most training I had for a program before actually going into the field. And it was a lot of personal stuff, a lot of tears, and our check-ins were deep. And, these places are the seed of transformation. I mean, really get there. I mean, can be vulnerable with each other. And I remember I got the training one time when I was coming to a class, and I was getting, they were reviewing my activities, and you seen I was ready to go in by myself. And the teacher, the person who was working with me was saying that, yeah, we want to do 5% preaching. And I think that's what the climate movement is sort of infamous for, like, preaching and alarming folks about the situation. It's like, oh my God, like, it's shaking people. Like, why don't you get this? And it's like, actually, you want to do 5% of the preaching, a little bit more of the teaching, 10% of that, and maybe like 85% is reaching, this listening space, like really getting what's there. And that's really just being present, because within it, like there's certain mountains of things, like mountains of issues that can just melt and immediately when just sitting back, taking an extra beat and just listening a little bit deeper and closer. So.
Absolutely. And speaking of listening, we'd like to ask people if they have any questions to submit those in the chat. We are at 12:52, just 8 minutes to the hour. So just being cognizant of our time together today. So I'll be looking for some questions coming into the chat, but as we prepare for that, I look too at some of this amazing work that you've done over time and all of these connections that we've shared. I just want to ask our California Naturalist staff to turn on everyone's videos now so we can have a little bit of an opportunity to connect with each other, to see each other, to see the community that is present here today. So just kind of stepping to that next place, AshEL, looking to the future and keeping in mind what you've shared about listening and connecting with the whole person and being conscious of the systems that we really have to make changes in, because the only way we can achieve justice is if we address the unjust systems. And underlying all of the climate issues we face today are these unjust systems. Various aspects of capitalism and gender issues and race issues that have become so prominent in the way we live in our society today. So just looking to the future and thinking about how we connect with our communities, what might be your top line recommendation for what would be the best thing we can do to start this practice of making those connections across our communities?
Yeah, that's a good question. Again, I think they may look different in different communities too, like based off of the conversation we're having. So what may be best way for different communities? I'm not sure exactly what everyone is here. It may be sort of specific to the communities that folks are in. Like when I was on a board of Hip Hop is Green. So what we did was, we know that hip hop was, we primarily work with folks of African American descent, Black and brown folks who are dealing with diabetes, obesity, and then we enroll them in the gardening, the composting, understanding the micro, like that whole world of that. So we mesh that, but we use hip hop culture because we're speaking to that particular community. That's a language that community can relate to. So I think it sort of goes back to this, like this listening piece and getting like what's really there. We did events, right, as a base ground for that. But so that's really how we worked in that space. I think there's other aspects of like really just looking at, on a policy level, like some of the people we work with in high school over the years, I noticed they went on and they do work in policy, but the way they got to that point wasn't necessarily by reading policy or something. It was getting to the emotion and getting to that point in which they felt like something was off, or something they had that they could do, but they didn't really know how to do. And we sort of nurtured that and developed those skills for them so that they can go into that space. So it's really subtle also. It's very simple in some ways how to start. And I think we already spoken to it. It definitely deals with relationships. Even we're going to go back home for Thanksgiving and it doesn't mean a lot of heated views, everyone, or not, because a lot of people aren't traveling. But we know that there's those tables that we sit at are some of those conversations that are the most potent conversations. And how we deal with those can push people deeper into their resignation and apathy, or their perception that you're crazy or whatever it is, or like, wow, like actually this is not so bad. Thank you for hearing me. There's more space there. And I think the interrelatedness between humans is the fabric that we can sort of, the baseline fabric that builds like policy change and system change, actually. Yeah, so anyways, we can go deeper, right? Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. We haven't had any questions pop up, but Jean Goulart just commented that advocacy education is something that she sees rising to the top because residents are often unaware of their impact on what's happening in their communities and how they can speak to that. One of the things that we're hoping to do with climate stewards across the California naturalist community is to raise awareness of how you can interface with your community organizations to support infrastructure changes and all of that. And just speaking to the breadth of our community, we have over 4,000 naturalists in our community, and we have 60 new climate stewards graduating next week. But we just had people share that they're from all over the state of California, from Calaveras to Riverside County to Sonoma to Santa Clara, Mendocino to San Diego. So just what you said, AshEL, is speaking to the relevance of what's happening in the community. I know that the issues that face us are very different. In San Diego, you might be dealing with sea level rise, whereas in Mendocino County, they have just put 100% containment around the August complex fire, which is the largest fire in California's recorded history of the last several hundred years at over 1 million acres. So we all face slightly different things, but we all are hoping to find a place of resilience where we are moving forward, not just to survive the changes of climate change, but to thrive together. And I think just so many of your words today really spoke to the breadth and depth of what is happening across not just the state of California, but also the country, with the different work that you've done in different places. And I really appreciate you sharing your words and experience with us today. I know that, I've known of your work for a while, and just hearing you speak today has helped me understand more about, how I can interface with my community as well. So we've got just about a minute left. So AshEL, I just wanted to thank you so much. And I know that we've had about 70 to 80 people on the line today, and we'll have more that will see this in our registration. We did add an evaluation link into the chat box. So if you would take a moment when we turn off the cameras to just share your thoughts about our presentation today, how we might continue to think about presentations on our webinars in the future. We also wanted to share that coming up in December, we have Joanna Flor Tavares. She's with UC Irvine, and her presentation will be on environmental justice as a path to addressing global climate disruption, simple and not so simple things we can do differently to make the world a better place. So AshEL, thank you so much for being our second speaker in this series. I really feel like you provided a great foundation for our ongoing work. And we will share your website link. I know you've got some other great videos. Food Fight is one of my other favorite videos that you've done that really takes that art that you do and puts a different vision on food deserts in our various communities, especially our Black communities and other communities of color and low income spaces. So thank you so much. We are at 1 o'clock. So folks, if you need to step off, please do so. But AshEL, since I've been talking a lot, I just wanted to see if there was something you wanted to wrap with.
Yeah, one thing, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to state was that I was reflecting on the previous question, and I think, when we look at our communities and we look at the organizations that are organizing, I think there's a lot of people in the communities that have been organizing for a long time that we need to have more cross-organizational communication. I really appreciate this platform for that. I see the work that you all are doing to, just raise awareness and bring different people from different communities together so we can expand that. I think this is perfect example of what interconnectivity we need to be doing, like from cross-organizationally, even to share resources and share insights. So thank you so much for holding this.
Yeah, thank you for that wonderful final observation, AshEL. Really do appreciate that. So lots of thanks in the chat if you haven't seen that, AshEL. And I hope that in the future we can maybe connect again. And I'm sure that some people will be checking out the other work that you do.
Indeed.
All right. Well, have a good day, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, and hope to see you on some more CONES webinars in the future. Bye-bye.